On that note then, if I may, please let me hand over to Lindsay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to see all of you here today. And I'm even more excited to be presenting on one of my favorite topics, multimodal projects and 21st century communication skills. I hope today you'll get a lot of good ideas for how, when, why, where to do multimodal projects with your students, both online, in digital form, and in face-to-face classes. I hope that if you have any questions, you'll feel free to ask them. If you think of questions later, I do have my email address at the very end of this presentation, and I'm always happy to talk with people. So please also feel free to contact me directly if you're too shy to ask in the Q&A box today. So today's presentation is why, when, how, and what of using multimodal projects. Now, if you're here today, you probably think that multimodal projects are a good idea, or at least you're very open to the idea of doing multimodal projects with your students. What I'm going to give you today is the rationale you can use with your administrators and with parents. So all of the other stakeholders who think that maybe projects aren't related to English education or to language education, this is what you can tell them. You pull out this research and this kind of argumentation, and I think it'll go a long way toward persuading them that projects in the classroom are vital and bring vitality to the classroom. So the first reason is projects can provide a kind of realistic context for purposeful language use. We all know that mindless drilling and mindless translation doesn't lead to learning a language. What does lead to learning a language is purposeful communication. And that's what projects can do. The contexts can be things like self-introductions, advertisements, recommendations, wanted posters, infographics or informational pamphlets, class magazines using various genres of writing, and so much more. Projects are very flexible because we use them in the real world too. And actually, that helps with cognition. They've found, research has found that doing with understanding is how people learn. It's not just memorizing, but doing with understanding why you're doing it. So in this case, the project creates a clear need to use English, a clear purpose for communication. And that purpose is self-expression in a particular context and for a particular audience. And so when students have a purpose, when they can understand why they're using English, why they're using this target language, they can begin to integrate the target language into their mental model of English. And that's what helps them make sense of what they are learning. Multimodal projects in particular also support embodied cognition. Remember, the research shows that the richer the perceptual experience, and therefore the mental perceptual simulation acquired, the better the student learning and understanding. So by adding different modes of communication to a project, students can experience that kind of embodiment, or at least a more richer perceptual experience than text alone. It also, by adding modes, allows students to experiment and explore. Some researchers have described this as bricolage, putting together many different things to experiment and help students understand in a deeply personal way. And finally, it allows possibilities of self-expression that are not possible with print alone. Furthermore, Daniel Pink has identified three main keys to motivation: autonomy, purpose, and mastery. And multimodal projects tick all of those criteria. Students have autonomy because they can choose how to express themselves. They can choose exactly what to say and how to say it using a wide variety of modes. They have purpose because they're not just making it for the teacher. And I'll get into this later. The key part of producing projects is making them for someone who's not just grading them, but for an authentic audience. Even if that authentic audience is just their peers, there's a reason they're doing it. There's a reason for using the language. And finally, if you structure the projects right, it allows students to demonstrate mastery in a wide variety of ways. And with projects that have a long enough lead time, students can actually revise their projects. They can review the language they don't quite have yet and improve it, and then improve the project as well, all of the different modes, not just for the audience, but also for themselves. So autonomy, purpose, mastery, multimodal projects are fantastic for student motivation. Projects also support multiple literacies. Now, you might be a little bit familiar with multiliteracies, but it specifically is oriented in new literacy studies, which is just fantastic. I highly recommend looking into this if you have any interest in the ways people express themselves and make meaning apart from just text. What new literacy studies says is design is situated, right? We all come from different backgrounds, different experiences, different cultures, and we grow up inheriting these patterns and conventions of meaning. What means something to me might mean something totally different to you. And at the same time, we can change what those symbols mean as active designers of meaning. So new literacy studies values the whole spectrum of communicative practices, including the skills involved in relating all of these different communicative practices to each other. It means that we can draw on our entire repertoire of semiotic resources to create meaning with consideration to an intended audience. This is communicating across difference, perspective taking. I have to understand who my audience is and what they understand in order for me to create the meaning I want to them. And also in valuing this whole spectrum of communicative practices, we kind of redefine what counts as knowledge, what counts as learning. And that can lead to a redistribution of semiotic power, the power to make and disseminate meanings. This means that your students who are kind of on English, maybe writing in English is not their strong point, speaking in English is not their strong point, those students are the ones that can excel through multimodal projects. It engages them and allows them to express themselves in a wide variety of ways. And you as a teacher can support them in doing that and say, yes, your knowledge is valued, even though you're not so good at grammar. That's all key to this. And that's key to manufacturing and supporting 21st century communicators, communicating in a wide variety of ways across difference. Now, you might be wondering, what is a mode? How do we have multiple modes? And what are semiotic resources? Well, modes and semiotic resources are pretty much anything that make meaning. They're part of how we communicate. So there's sound, even just me talking to you. You can tell by my intonation, maybe, that I'm excited. You can tell by how loud or how soft something is. Those mean different things. And specifically in multimodal projects, students can integrate all of these semiotic resources. It's not just text and word choice. but the images and what the images represent and what they convey, how they convey it, what the nuances are, the spatial relationships, whether things are big or small and how close or far away they are. You can use special effects if you're using a digital tool, the use of color, font, music, interactivity with the target audience, with your authentic audience, size, emphasis, sounds, not just music, but if there's a voiceover or a sound effect, boing, that all conveys meaning. The language students use, we value translanguaging, right? Students can move back and forth, not just from English or from the language they're learning, but also maybe carefully, with intention, integrate their L1 as well, depending on who the audience is, right? If you're doing videos, motion, movement, and timing are all part of the semiotic resources your students pull into play. And of course, there are cultural references, not just across nations, but even within countries, within cultures. There's you might notice the little squid here in my cultural references. That's not an American thing. I think that the other Americans in attendance today are probably wondering, what on earth is she doing with that squid? That is a cultural reference for a book group I'm involved in. So I wouldn't use that in a presentation for people outside that culture. But if I'm addressing an audience of fellow book group members, I can integrate that cultural reference and it'll mean something to them. And that's why an authentic audience is so important, because we create meaning in a situated way with the audience in mind. Another reason to use multimodal projects is HOTS. You know HOTS, right? Think about Bloom's taxonomy. Higher order thinking skills. These are kind of similar to multiliteracies. They mash together really well. This is the old Bloom's taxonomy, where analysis, synthesis, and evaluation are the higher order thinking skills. And then there's Bloom's revised taxonomy, which really is more appropriate in today's digital age, so that the higher order thinking skills involve analyzing, evaluating, and creating new or original work. All of these happen when your students make multimodal projects. For example, if you're creating a digital project, you have to analyze what different images mean. What are the nuances? What will that evoke in your target audience? And then you evaluate, you critique and judge which one is better, which one expresses what I want to express. And then you begin to design and create and experiment with that bricolage, right? By adding new things. Ooh, I don't want a shark there. How about a dove and a frame? And we'll adjust the spatial relationships there. Then in peer feedback, all of this happens again. The analysis, evaluation, and creation all happens through the peer feedback. So for example, a student might suggest experimenting with adding a stamp here, like on a passport, or you could add a heart because you love this place. It also applies to language use as students analyze, evaluate, and kind of experiment with using English or whatever language they're learning to express themselves. So one student might suggest, I recommend you trip to Seoul, which another student might notice is a little bit wrong or awkward. I think travel to Seoul or visit Seoul is right. So that the peers, as well as the creator, can work together to analyze, evaluate, and create language that expresses the creator's intention. So when and how to use projects. I use it all the time in my classes. I use projects to introduce new language, in those situations, I don't choose the vocabulary in advance. I don't choose the grammar in advance. I pick projects that I think might elicit particular forms I want to focus on, or might elicit specific words that I think students should learn. But most of the target language comes from the language students find themselves needing to use during the project itself. I might teach them a few key phrases that will help them in the project, but most of it comes from them looking it up in the dictionary, trying to express themselves, asking me, asking their peers, teacher, how can I say this? How can I say this in English? And then at the end of the class, we might gather some of those, and those become new target language for students to learn. A really good book for this, if you're interested in using this kind of way to introduce new language, is A Framework for Task-Based Learning by Jane Willis. Really, it has a very interesting format for task-based learning that involves this particular style of learning new language. I also do use projects in individual units so that students practice language that I've already introduced, or grammatical forms that I've already introduced that I want them to produce. And I actually have a finale project in all of my classes. I try to build my syllabus so that students have specific bits of language that eventually will build on each other so they can make one big cumulative project at the end of the term. So it should elicit the target language in particular that I want them to be practicing and using. And then there are projects that have no specific target language. It's pretty much free, and students use the English they already know. That's the approach I use in the writing class I teach, which isn't just, of course, not just text writing, but involves a lot of multimodal projects. The students are actually applying what they've been studying for so long in schools, but they're applying it in a specific context for a purpose and for a specific audience, so they can finally understand why they've been learning all of this English and all of these patterns of communication. Now, if you have a long-term project or long-ish term, say several classes or several weeks, then this is a really great process to use. I find students can do the project, they get feedback from their peers or their teacher, they revise the project, they review the language that they're kind of weak on, and then they apply it again to make the project better. This is where you as the teacher can pop in and say, ooh, I think you need to review how to use commas. Ooh, I think you should review how to use the present perfect. And you can refer them back to worksheets they've already done or exercises that can improve that particular skill for them. Or they can just revise and improve the multimodal communicative aspects, right? And then finally, they turn in the project, and that's their way to demonstrate mastery. Now, I know you are all busy teachers. I know I'm crazy during the semester. I don't have time to check 300, 600 projects, right? Now, if you're busy, if you have a whole bunch of students in your classes and you just can't spend time giving each one feedback during the creation process, then you can simplify this by making your main role assigning the project and then giving feedback on the final project itself. The actual get feedback part can be peer feedback. And actually, that's something I do in a lot of my classes because I do have hundreds of students doing these. My main rule, my first rule, is 3 before me. That means that there's a lot less one-on-one feedback that I have to do. My 3 that I usually recommend are Grammarly, which lets students check their grammar in an online form. And I do tell them, don't just take Grammarly's advice. Grammarly is sometimes crazy, check it. And then 2 or 3 peers are the other 3 before me. I do make my students do peer feedback in groups, and Padlet is really good at supporting this. And then they share their final drafts with their classmates, at least their classmates. We sometimes discuss whether to publish it more widely. And again, Padlet is great for that. You might need to model good feedback. The first couple of times that I did projects with my students, their feedback was, hey, I like BTS too, which that's not feedback. I mean, that's great for connection, but what feedback does is improve the project, right? And some students would also take that opportunity just to insult each other. You know, one student's feedback was smell. That's not helpful. That's not productive. That's not constructive. So then I started actually showing students examples of good and bad feedback, and it's improved a lot. You can also require a particular format for feedback, like one thing that worked well, two things that can be improved. Something like that also helps. As a teacher, you could give a descriptive type of feedback rather than a grade. That's what I prefer, although I can't always do that because the university requires us to grade on a curve. So a specific number of A's, B's, and C's or lower. But if you're able to do this, it's fantastic. You basically set out what is probably going to be good, what's going to be bad, what could be improved. I shouldn't say bad, right? But what could be improved. And then you add more as you check the projects. Then just copy and paste the parts that apply and customize it as needed for each student. Another way you can save grading time with your hundreds of students is create a rubric. Make your rubric very carefully. Make it part of the initial assignment so that students know what they're working toward, what is a good grade, what will constitute a good project. And then you can also add this as part of the peer feedback process if you wish, so that the peers actually complete the rubrics for each other. I recommend for multimodal projects that you include not just mechanics and content, not just the language stuff, but organization, effectiveness, and so on. You know, the multimodal part of multimodal projects, and leave space for your individual comments and your customized comments for students. Another tip is give your students time to do it. Give them time in class, give them enough lead time to think about a topic, to make the project. These projects take a lot longer than you think. So if you assign them as homework, make sure that is their only homework for that week, actually. And finally, don't forget to publish. I keep talking about an authentic audience, and that's what publishing means, actually making the finished work available to others. Now, an authentic audience could be their classmates. That's perfectly acceptable. If they're just sharing it with their class, if they're just doing a gallery walk or just looking on Padlet, that's still an audience, and that's still a form of publishing. You could expand it out to the parents, expand it out to the school, to the community, or even make it available to the public. Now, I get a little hesitant about expanding it beyond just our school community. So I actually negotiate with my students. I ask them, who should I make this available to? Are we advertising it to the Gwangju community? Can I share this with teachers at sessions like this? Do you want to make it completely open to the public so that you can advertise it wherever you want to? If the project is going to be shared only with classmates, usually I make publishing mandatory. They have to share it with their classmates. They don't get a choice about that. You have to post it on Padlet. You have to put it out for the gallery walk, something like that. But as it gets more and more open, I make it more and more optional for students so that they don't have to share their work if they don't want to. Sometimes this work is deeply personal. Sometimes they're shy. Almost, you know what? I think every student, when given the choice of sharing all of the projects that they've created during the semester, every student has chosen at least one project that they're particularly proud of and have chosen to share that if we have a public publication. So another question you might be wondering is, okay, so what about, should it be digital or analog? Digital projects are great because you can make them anytime, anywhere. Both make and sharing. It eliminates manual dexterity as the middleman. I can't draw. I'm not very artistic, but look, I can use the computer pretty well. So it doesn't depend on how good you are at art. It depends on your mastery of this other form. And actually, it lets students do amazing things without knowing anything about coding. So this kind of black box scaffolding hides the creation process so that students can focus on the process of creation itself. Analog perks, it's quick and easy, students know how to do it, and students have access to the same tools. With digital projects, maybe students don't have the same phones, they don't know how to use computers well. At least with analog projects, everybody knows how to use scissors and glue and markers. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to briefly say a good way to judge whether you should go digital or analog is what does technology add to the project that an analog version cannot provide? So think about the student's relationship to the technology. Is it going to be passive, interactive, or creative? And how about the technology itself? Does it replace, amplify, or transform traditional practice being analog versions? And so this is the PICRAT model. I think if it's creative and transforms or amplifies traditional practice, it's probably worth going for a digital tool rather than an analog one, if you've got the time to support that. So what can students make? What are these digital multimodal projects that I'm talking about? First, in my class, we make advertisements. This is one of our face-to-face analog versions. My students plan a 7-day tour of Korea. They prepare in small groups and then present individually to clients using a 3-2-1 sales pitch. That's our variation on the 4-3-2, which is students, they get one client, they give their sales pitch for 3 minutes. The clients switch, then they have a new client. They give the same sales pitch for 2 minutes, then switch, and then 1 minute. So this is a fluency exercise wherein they don't change the content, they change their pace of speaking. So they stop, well, they gradually decrease their like, so, and as you do it again and again, you become more fluid and fluid in your presentation. We did change this to an online version when we started online classes in 2020. I allowed 1 to 3 students to prepare it together. They had to prepare at least 2-minute video, and they did have to include specific class grammar because this was our cumulative project at the end of the semester. Another thing we did in our face-to-face classes was an advertisement for books students had read during our extensive reading time in class. This was an individual project where students had to, again, include specific class grammar that we had been building toward throughout the semester. And then again, they did a 3-2-1 sales pitch, and we did a gallery walk as well, where the projects were placed around the room with sticky notes, and the students walked and looked at the projects and then left nice comments for their peers. When we went online only, I changed this. We didn't have extensive reading time, so I changed it to advertisements for whatever students wanted to advertise, their favorite movies, games, TV shows, anything like that. It was an individual project and again, did have to include specific class grammar and had to be at least 2 minutes long. I've had students make wanted posters. In particular, we were practicing has been, ing, has been stealing, has been robbing, has been spitting, like that. It could be in teams or individual. We've done this both digitally, in class, face-to-face. I sent the students out with their smartphones and they took pictures. They really enjoyed creating specific problems that their classmates were creating and then recreating those. The analog version in our face-to-face classes was made entirely with colored pencils and markers and paper. I instructed students not to post the name of the classmate who was the criminal, and instead the other students had to guess who it was. So the students, I think, had a lot of fun creating crimes for each other. I've done digital self-introductions. We've done, in the early weeks of class, we've done videos, and in all of my classes, we've done personal ads, multimodal personal ads, which is really good for the next step we do, which is choosing a pen pal. And again, these are great for sharing on Padlet and doing Q&As on Padlet. Experience stories, where we're practicing talking about experiences using the present perfect. I have done whatever, I have seen. We were also practicing most, least plus est. So the scariest day ever, the most exciting trip ever, that kind of format. And for my writing class, we publish everything in a culminating publication. Students do different multimodal projects, focusing on different genres of writing throughout the semester. And then we publish it in what students usually vote to make public, digital magazine using Google Sites. So just a quick look at my favorite tools. Story Jumper is great for storybooks. It allows you to upload photos or choose from different pictures and icons. All of these tools are free and easy to use because I don't like to pay money and I have the attention span of a goldfish. So if I can't figure out a tool in 2 minutes, I throw it away. These are easy tools that are totally free. Still images, you can actually use a whole bunch of different tools. I like Canva. Right now, Canva is my favorite tool. Adobe Spark is a close second. Smore does interactive posters, like the wanted posters that I just showed you. PhotoVC is a good, easy way to do photo collages. And then these are some really good resources for finding images that you can legally use. They're not copyrighted. They're all either public domain or Creative Commons. A lot of them will tell you exactly the kind of attribution you need to include. For videos, my favorite tools are Animoto, Adobe Spark, Canva. And if you want to do animated explainer videos, then My Simple Show is good. If you want to record your screen, Screencast-O-Matic is a pretty decent way to do it. Also Zoom. Here are my references if you want to read up on all of these many things that I've thrown at you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I've also got some resources available in this, it's a Google Drive folder, my digital resources. I don't have this presentation in that folder, but I do have handouts for past presentations I've done on projects, tech tools, and creativity. Some of those are a little bit old, so the tools are no longer around, but take a look, see if there are any tools you're interested in learning and using, and have fun with your projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was really, really interesting. If I could ask you all just to show your appreciation to Lindsay and just type clap into the chat window, that would be great. And we do also have some time for a few questions as well. So if you do have any questions also for Lindsay, please pop them into the Q&A box as well. Whilst we're waiting also for the questions to arrive, I think it might be interesting. We did get a question a little bit early on, but I think that you answered it very, very succinctly towards the end of your presentation about what exactly a multimodal project is. And by that, I understand that you're talking about not just asking students to speak, but also to create things, in an analog fashion, create things in a digital fashion, in fact, create and to augment whatever it is that they're planning to communicate. So thinking in terms of the message, yeah, and the multimodal project is the communication format. Is that right?
Right. Well, a mode is anything that communicates meaning. So, for example, volume is a mode, you know, or softness. That all conveys some kind of meaning. So when I say multimodal, I mean not just written text, but look at all the aspects that convey meaning. Is the font really big? Is it curly? Is it happy? Is it an angry font? The size, the emphasis, like there are so many ways we make meaning that's not just printed text. So multimodal means just add different ways of communicating meaning, images, sound, color, size. Is it 3D? Is it flat? Yeah.
I think that it's interesting as educators, we can often just focus a little bit too much on the words that we're trying to convince the students to come up with. And we focus on whether their vocabulary is correct, whether their sentence structure and whether their grammar is correct as well, and maybe even intonation and pronunciation. And we don't actually think beyond that we communicate as human beings, and there are so many aspects of communication. They should all be part of that. So I think that this is fascinating, absolutely fascinating stuff. One of the words that you used many times in your presentation, which for me is one of the big takeaways, is the word audience. And I would like to ask you a question. We can see clearly here that audience is really important, that up until now, a lot of what happens in the English language classroom, the audience is the teacher, singly the teacher, and the teacher's perspective there, and their role is merely to tell the students whether they got the language right. Whereas I think here what you're doing is you're saying, no, what we want the students to do is to find out actually multitude of different audiences and have them focus first and foremost on the other students. And you mentioned a few different types of feedback. One would be, I guess, feedback on the content itself, almost like your emotional reaction. Oh, I love that, I don't like it. A second would be maybe feedback on how the content could be changed. And a third type of feedback would be on the language used, whether it's correct, whether it's the right words, the right grammar. Given that you've got those three different types of feedback, you mentioned that you can also prepare your students. What would be your suggestion to teachers who are thinking about how to get their students to understand feedback in those different ways you can feedback?
Well, honestly, I think students are prepared to do this already. Our students are already living in a multimodal world. I mean, just walking out on the street, there are signs, there are colors, they mean different things in different countries and in different situations. So our students already know modes, they're familiar with the meanings, they're participating in online communities, they're creating their own Instagram pages or playing games that have different modes of communication. They're watching television shows and movies. So students are already primed to do this and to give feedback for each other. I think you have to, what works for me is helping students become comfortable with giving that kind of feedback, because my students are very reluctant to criticize. So I think the 3 before me really helps because it makes it required that they improve the project as much as possible. So it's kind of a team effort to make it better rather than a criticism of you didn't do it well. It's the audience will understand this better. Here's an outside perspective on that. And I think requiring a certain number of criticisms or things that could be improved also helps diminish that kind of affective reluctance to seem too critical. So does that answer your question?
No, it does. It does. It does. It actually leads on to a different question as well, which was one of the first questions that came in, which was, what's the impact of culture? Now, I think that the original question was, what's the impact on culture of the students on whether they would be willing to do, or the types of modes that they would be interested in? And I'd like to expand that, not just that question, which I think is very, very interesting, but also the impact of culture on the types of feedback that students are prepared to give. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as far as the types of feedback that students are prepared to give, I think in a lot of situations, they're reluctant, like I said, to be critical. But if you are requiring them to, and if you frame it as, you must help improve this project, take an outside perspective on it, will the audience understand it? What would be unclear to the audience? Give them some kind of guiding questions that reframe it not as criticisms, but as helping and as taking the audience into account. I think that really helps. As far as culture in creating these, like I said, students today, they're already very multimodal. They're already very aware of these things. And I have yet to find students who are not interested. In fact, okay, so for the book projects, some students were less interested just because they were less interested in the books. But those students who are less interested in English are often the ones that can really shine when they have an opportunity to use English for a purpose to express themselves. So I think as long as students understand what you're doing as a teacher, that this is part of communication. This is part of communicating across difference, communicating to people who are not in the same culture, who have different experiences than you do. Or if they're in the same national culture, they still have different experiences and different perspectives. So I think if you frame your class as not just being English, but communication, then it really does make it clear to students that this is related to English language learning, guys. It really, really is. It's rare that you will be communicating only by text with somebody in English. These are the situations where you want to use English, and these are the different ways that you can communicate and supplement your English communication. So I think all of that together really makes this very flexible in any culture. It just depends whether you want to be digital or analog and how you can supplement your target language, giving it a context. When do students use that language? And then thinking of a project that will let them express themselves in realistic-ish ways.
Indeed. I mean, I think it's interesting when you look at culture and you ask yourself, you know, what is the culture of my students or myself? But you've also got the culture of the student and the culture of the teacher. And part of the role of the teacher also is to expand people's minds towards different things. I want to come back to one of the words that you used just now, which was about, you know, making it a team effort. And one of the questions that was submitted just now, it was an anonymous question, was that how do you deal with, I mean, do you ever consider group projects rather than individual projects? And if you do, how do you deal with the workload or the work share? I mean, do you ever end up in situations where maybe one student feels that they've done the lion's share and they should maybe take more of the credit? Do you have to deal with anything like that?
I hated group projects when I was in university and in high school because I was always the one who did everything. So I can definitely understand that. What I've done as far as that goes is, first of all, it's optional. You don't have to work with a group. You do have to get peer feedback. And I think that's really where a lot of the work comes in. A lot of the peer teaching comes in through peer feedback. I let students choose their own groups. And there are certain students who nobody will work with, and that's okay. They seem happy working on their own. Although I do invite other students, are you sure you don't want to work with her? So making it optional is one way. Another thing I've done in the past that I've kind of moved away from, but it did seem to work, is part of their grade comes from their group members. So the group members actually grade each other as far as participation in the project goes. I've done that not just with a rubric where they actually can give a perfect score to everybody, but also where I give the group a certain number of points and they can divvy it up according to what each person did. I've also asked them what exactly they contributed to their group project, and that is part of their grade for that group project. If they can't think of something specific they contributed to that, if they didn't have a specific role in the group, their participation score does drop a little bit.
And it's interesting. It's interesting also to think about how the mechanics of the grading will impact the way in which people react